Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the XDS podcast. I am excited to say this is our fifth podcast in the series. Hopefully, those of you who have come along for the ride are enjoying the series so far. I have to say a big thank you to Kelly Brunton for her hard work producing the cast. And I also have not yet had the opportunity to acknowledge our sound engineer, Chris Popke, for making us sound like this is actually a professional operation. So thank you, Chris, for that. Of course, I'm a bit biased, so others should be the judge of how this sounds, but I think it sounds pretty damn good. Today on the podcast, we have another very special guest, Mr. Nigel Franks. Nigel is currently studio production director with Snowed Studios, a highly successful development studio based in Ottawa, Canada. Welcome, Nigel.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
Nigel, if you don't mind, briefly introduce yourself for us.
Yeah, sure. My name is Nigel. I've been in the games industry for, I think, since about 2000 or so. Unofficially working on some marketing for a Nintendo project back in 2000 for Majora's Mask, and I think you might have had something to do with that at that time. We were all working at the same company way back in that day. Before I ended up getting into some game studios in 2002. And I've had the opportunity to work on a variety of different game platforms, from Nintendo to all of the consoles, working at some studios such as Next Level Games. We got to work together again at Electronic Arts, which was a lot of fun. And after that, spent some time in indies, and now landing at Snowed Studios for the last 4 years, which has been an amazing ride.
Right on, man. And yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I mean, you and I go way back. I think you were one of the first people that I worked with at EA working on that little Marvel title. Maybe we won't mention the name of it because I think it only sold about 10 copies, which also Chris Popke, our sound engineer, was doing audio QA on that at the time, coincidentally. But yeah, I think you were running cover at our third-party dev, and I was back home wrangling artists and animators.
I kind of felt like I had Stockholm syndrome living in California at that time and figuring out how we're going to make this thing actually work. But it was a lot of fun, a lot of learning, and definitely helped inform some of the decisions I'm making today too, which is great.
Right on. So Nigel, you delivered a fantastic talk on the subject of why growing a studio and innovation are harder than they should be, which, by the way, won the award for Most Innovative Talk at XDS 2023. So congratulations on that. How did your career journey influence this topic, and why was it important for you to address?
It's a really good question. I guess over the span of about 30 years working in tech, you get to see a lot of different companies, how they operate, how they grow. And one of the things I noticed was that there seemed to be a lot of the same mistakes that were being made with companies that would scale. And you see some of them do it really well for a short period of time, and some of them start to falter after a while. And I always thought, the funny thing is when you're junior in your career, you've got all the answers, and it's like, we should be doing things this way, that way, the other. And the more I'd progressed in my career, the more that I'd learned, the more I realized I still had more to learn about this topic. And why it was really near and dear to me was that Snowed Studios, after joining the Keywords family, had this plan to grow, and I was part of that. And I wanted to make sure I was doing things right. And as we were putting our plan together, I realized we had this great plan, didn't have the skills because I guess gained a measure of humility, which I think is great. I think I was biting off more than I could chew. So I ended up going back to school to study how companies are scaling properly. So as a side note, full-time school plus full-time pandemic at the same time, when you have a full-time job, 10 of 10 would not recommend. However, the knowledge and skills coming out of that were great. But during that entire school program, when I was at the University of Ottawa MBA school, we did talk to a lot of startups at that time that also had scale-up issues, and I've seen this with other game studios as well. And there's so much knowledge that we've applied to our own growth here at Snowed Studios, where we were somewhere around 30 people when I joined. We're over 200 now, or just around the 200 mark now, and continuing that scaling growth. That these aren't problems that are unique to us. Like a lot of us in game development have these very similar problems about how to develop your staff, how to make sure your financials are solid. And I just wanted to be able to share that information with people, saying, all right, so here's a blueprint for how things can go well. And here's some examples where it didn't go well. Here's some examples where it really did. And hopefully people had something they could take away from that and actually use. And some of the feedback that I got from people that had watched that talk had basically said exactly that. this is great. We're exactly at this point over here. So what do we do right now? And so the side conversations after that, and including some of the Q&A and after the session, really reflected some of that. So I felt really honored that I was able to have that kind of discussion with other professionals that are facing some of the same problems. And it was neat to see that although everybody's situation is unique, the problems themselves may not be entirely so. And some people may have already solved some of those issues.
That's fantastic. And I definitely saw many people studiously taking notes in the audience as you were going through the presentation. I'm curious, Nigel, what did you personally take away from this experience of delivering this session at XDS last September?
Another lesson in humility, I guess, is probably the biggest thing. Like really deeply honored that I would be able to share some of this information. And I think I wasn't expecting it to have the kind of response from the audience that I got. I was really surprised with the level of openness that people were coming up and talking about some of the issues they discussed. And it was a really great series of frank, open discussions with people about some of the issues they're facing and how they want to tackle them. For me, seeing how many people saying that in the audience saying, I've got that same problem with scaling, can you help me? Or what would I do? And what are the resources I should be looking at to be able to solve these scaling problems were really neat. And one of the things I talked about were several pillars of successful growth, and those answers always tended to come back to those, which were great. So which is like define your strategy, make sure your culture can support growth, make sure that you've got a right attitude towards innovation, and make sure you've got the right governance and financials in place. And so people were always struggling with one or more of those. And sometimes I'd even forgotten something like, oh yeah, I had to make sure I'm focusing on the financials as well as promoting innovation. And the funny thing about innovation, a lot of people didn't realize that innovation is a lot harder than you think. We're in an industry where everybody talks about the same sequels in games every year, the same features and all the rest of that. But to actually innovate, you've got to take a group of people completely separate from everyone else, hide them in a corner and let them come up with that innovation themselves. Because if it's mandated from outside, it's just never going to work. And there's some really great examples in the talk that go into some detail about that better than I can here, because there's some professionals that have been working on this for many, many years, like Salim Ismail in his book, Exponential Organizations is an excellent example of how companies can fail at innovation and how they succeed at innovation. So it was neat to see these kind of things. For me, the biggest takeaway was seeing that people had all these same problems and nothing seemed unique under the sun, but it was great to bring them all together under one roof and have those really great, really authentic conversations with the people about some of the issues they'd faced.
Good stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if people bring their next set of questions for you to XDS in Vancouver in September. So be prepared for that. So Nigel, thanks again for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have a true industry veteran in our midst, still fighting the good fight.
I still think I'm a kid. My wife tells me I am anyway.
Now we bring you why growing a studio and innovation are harder than they should be. Thanks again, Nigel.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a tremendous honor to be here speaking with so many compatriots in the games industry, especially after 3 years of none of us being able to go anywhere. So it's the first really big trip for a lot of us, I think, and it's really great to be here as well. One thing David mentioned, I just finished some school. I just spent also 3 years listening to people talk and be talking heads in a classroom, and I'd rather not have that kind of presentation, so I like to be as interactive as possible. We've got a microphone that can go along, so when you see some material that you'd like to ask some questions on, please feel free, and we'll have the opportunity to have some information going back and forth, because this is an interactive thing. We all learn from each other. It's just the kind of situation where we're here learning from everybody here at XDS, which is awesome. So without any further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about scaling studios and how fun and challenging that can be, and some of the great things that happen along the way, and some things to keep an eye out for, because I know a lot of us here are in smaller studios or mid-sized studios and have the opportunity that we want to be growing a studio from one level to the next. And I'd rather pass on some of the information that we learned along the way with Snowden Studios and some of the other information that I've learned along the way in about 27 years of scaling different software development companies. So, here's a couple of things we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to read all this down. I think you can all see that fairly enough. But a few things just before we begin. Just please, as with everybody, just keep the mobiles on silent. And also, at the end of the session, please review it, because otherwise I have to stay in this horribly not so nice city where I used to live. So I'm going to start because everybody at the studio tells me, Nigel, you tell too many stories, so I have to start with that. Anybody recognize this? Far Side, 1990? I actually remember the day that I read this in the newspaper in 1990, and this was pre the huge boom in video games that we've had. And it's kind of interesting because basically what they're saying is that these parents are idiots, because they're looking ahead to the jobs in 2005, imagining that letting their kid play these games is going to erupt with these amazing jobs for the child, right? And so the irony behind all this is that, take a look at these numbers. In 2005, when I had the opportunity to work with one of the greatest racing teams of the time in working on Need for Speed, those salaries actually matched the kind of salaries that we had at the time for the people that we were trying to hire into the studio. And some of those the salaries, even for me as a manager, were higher than mine. And that's one of the things you have to get used to, is that when you're working in a large studio, sometimes that's going to happen. So I like to show all this because it shows how often things change for us in our industry and how rapidly it's growing. And that irony is something that it's just definitely not lost on me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my background, mostly about all the cool things that happen when we're scaling studios. So way back when, I got to march around and do things and wear a pretty uniform. And if there was one overriding theme when I was putting all this together, when it came down to scaling a studio, the theme is surprises. So, for example, I showed this inside the company I work for, Snowed In Studios, an extension of Keyword Studios. And I saw the chat going by in Teams, and somebody said, "Nice picture of the drill instructors course parade in 1987, Franks." And I was like, how would anybody know that? And he was actually somebody who was there at the time who actually works in Keywords Montreal, which I thought was kind of cool. That led to me going into, from the cadets, going into the infantry, jumping out of helicopters and dodging and catching bullets, that kind of thing, which really doesn't give you all that background that you need for software development, but I somehow found a way in. So this was my first software company back in 1996. But I ended up going back and forth between Vancouver and Ottawa at the time. We ended up opening up a small office here in Vancouver, and I just thought, this is amazing, I'm never going to leave. The city is amazing, making huge proclamations like, obviously I'm never going to leave, and I left a couple of years later after that. So the other proclamation was like, I'll never see inside this magic castle on the hill up on Sanderson Way. And of course I learned as well that I actually did get to look inside that as well. I'll tell you a little bit about that. So over that time, after that, I ended up coming back to my hometown of Ottawa, adoptive hometown, because I'm an immigrant here in the country. And now here I am with Snowed In Studios for the last 3.5 years, and it's been absolutely fantastic. Great group of people. And what's really interesting about this is that I'm working with such a smart group of people in the studio that's always encouraging me to up my game. That's pretty important for me. So for the people that are interested in here in being and learning about scaling, there's two different ways you can go about doing this, and there's two different types of people that this talk could be for. We have one overriding principle, and we started thinking about this as a studio as to how we ended up defining all this, what are our values. The most interesting thing for us was that one overriding principle for how we built the studio is that value is people first. So if you agree with that, that's great. This talk is for you. There's another way of looking at it. First off, anybody recognize what this is? No fellow sci-fi nerds in here like me? No guesses? It's kind of written in the corner in this other picture down here. No? This is a copy of The Rules of Acquisition from these guys, from 25-year-old sci-fi. So essentially, it's a series of rules that dictate how one particular society works in Star Trek, which is amazing. And it's all about greed and acquisition of wealth. And this is the kind of rules that you see inside the rules of acquisition, including rule number 211, which I thought was interesting. 211 was my old squadron number. I kind of laughed at that. Rule 109 is probably my favorite one. Dignity in an empty sack is worth the sack. So forget your dignity, just get their money. So if that's how you operate, that's not what this kind of talk is for. But throughout my period in working in the games industry, I had the opportunity to work with some great studios building some of these titles here. And each one of these had to do with scaling a team from 5 to 50 to 75 to 100. And the beauty about this is, being here in Vancouver, there's some people in this room that helped and were part of this whole organization as we started putting all these together, which is great. I bumped into people already that have worked on 2 of these titles here, a third one over here. I'm working with a couple of them right now. Just bumped into my old friend Chris, who helped me work with that Marvel title. And basically, my perspective on this is fantastic. I'm doing this amazing job, and I can do these amazing things. Don't screw this up. So also throughout that period, I've had the opportunity to work on a whole pile of different video apps. So each one of these required anywhere from a team of 5 to 150 from studios that started off very small and then grew into 200 and 300 organizations. Now, I'm not saying all this because it's like, oh, glory me, look at all the stuff I've done. It's like, no, these are like really big challenges where we come together as a group of people, and there's no one person that can solve this problem. It's a group thing where we figure out exactly how big we need to be. And some of these names are pretty big, and if you screw them up, people will remember, right? Movies Anywhere has now actually been translated into something called Disney Plus. Show Me for the Canadians here no longer exists, which is really unfortunate because it was kind of cool that we had something like that. Twitch obviously is still kicking around. We did the PS4 version of that, NFL, etc. But the whole point of that is that with all of this, there are different ways of looking at how teams grow and different problems that come along with that. So this is what the headcount of each one of those organizations look like roughly from the time that I've been working in software back in 1994 to present day. So the blue column here is where the headcount started and where it ended up, all the way up to Snowden Studios. The best thing about this is the learning aspect, personally for me, and what we ended up learning about how this works. So with this one, real simple, how to burn through somebody else's venture capital money and not have a solid exit. That is a hard lesson to learn. It's one you have to pick yourself up off the ground and learn from again. And I tried doing that with consulting and had a small exit from that, which is kind of cool. I had a great experience with Next Level Games, and the personal learning there was, what is the value of a studio head who already has an MBA and knows how to get a bucket of money and manage that bucket of money going forward? And that was really key for the success of that particular studio, as well as another studio in town that ended up getting acquired by EA called Black Box Games. Both of those studio heads knew each other from the same MBA class. And that was teaching me, it's like, maybe I should go to school at some point. And so for about 20 years, I was thinking that's something I wanted to do. Throughout my time working with EA, I learned about scaling for a publisher, and suddenly when there's a lot of cash available, that really changes the world as to how you can scale very quickly. For example, that Marvel project was a co-development project with another studio in California, and we realized that we needed to be able to scale up our team here. We basically went from 6 to about 35, if I remember correctly, or 35 or 40, literally overnight. And that has a whole series of problems that go along with that as well, and benefits too. This other one, a really interesting company, the one that's doing all the TV apps, had a 70 million exit. They were purchased by Warner. I'm okay with not being part of that because there were just basically that company was so far in debt at that particular time that there was a very few amount of people that could profit from it. And then finally, this last bit of scaling experience that I've had was I got a lot to learn and it's time to go back to school. So it's really interesting for me in that at this point, it was just perfect from a pandemic standpoint. I can do all that, get some additional learning from that, but essentially change management needs a lot of improvement along with a couple of other skills as well. So enough about that. The one thing that's really interesting here are the common threads throughout all of this. And this is the one that really surprised me, that through all of this, you'd think that if you have the ability to have a great P&L throughout the whole aspect of this, it's going to be great. But all those assumptions I found out were wrong. So they're only the very basic beginning and start of essentially starting to scale the studio. This one was probably the one that's the most important, and that the actual studio culture that you have is way more important than just the financial acumen of growing a studio, because it's really going to be defining how you act, how you grow. And I was having this conversation just before lunch, I think, with somebody. It was really important to hear that it's like, yeah, some studios do this, they grow rapidly overnight with a whole pile of juniors, and the seniors aren't happy with the culture anymore, and they leave. And what good is that? Force of will, cult of personality. Anybody remember the movie, and again, I'm dating myself, startup.com? It's a great movie about startups in the internet era. And that was all about the cult of personality getting 60 million on a napkin and then blowing through that as quickly as possible over the span of a couple of years, not having anything left over. Without the knowledge, it's going to be basically hurting you. Never let yourself get complacent. Competition is good. And this is the biggest learning for me, if I can impose on anybody to walk away from this, is understand what change management actually is, because a lack of expertise in change management is really going to hurt you if you're not familiar with that. And after talking to people who did have those MBAs and started studios, that basically it can really help in some cases. And I'm not saying this promoting it by any stretch of the imagination. It's just like, this is what I thought I needed to be able to help me go back and be able to help scale a studio. But there are pluses and minuses, right? Because basically you try to do that while you're building a studio in school. This is where you get to see my artwork. This is me before the MBA, and this is me after the MBA, right? So it took a little bit while for me to recover from that. I think I'm about halfway in between there right now. It's kind of cool. Right, so here's the thing. Scaling is hard. It has implications. It's hard on the people going through it. There are a lot of questions that happen, so here's why you shouldn't do it. This was the growth curve that we had over the last few years. If you take a look at 2010, 2011, it's pretty steady up until the Keywords acquisition in 2018. And then it's been pretty high upward since then, which is kind of neat. And this is actually out of date. So we're probably about 9 months out from this last count. I think we're closer to the 188 mark as of today. And it's continuing. So a couple of reasons why you shouldn't. Any guesses why you shouldn't scale? Nobody? Bueller? I heard it's expensive. Any other reasons why you shouldn't scale?
Mental fatigue.
Mental fatigue, that's a good one, yeah. I heard productivity, sorry?
It breaks your culture.
It breaks your culture, absolutely, it can do that. So I'm going to take some advice from somebody way smarter than me that's got a startup in Toronto. Her name is Catherine Homewood, and she's the CEO of SheerTex, completely different business than technology. But essentially, everything breaks. And I don't mean a couple of things here and there. I mean, everything breaks. Here's the quote that comes from Catherine in the Globe and Mail's report on business. I believe it's a report of the top 100 companies in Canada. Essentially that everything, when you try to scale by 5%, everything breaks internally. And they're trying to grow by 100% or more every year. Everything's broken all the time. And this is common with, and a lot of us have seen this in studios ourselves, right? So everything can just start falling apart if you're not preparing for it. So for us, our strategy is to grow, and I don't mean growing by just looking at the P&L, but we want to have a healthy game development culture in the city of Ottawa, because there never really has been one. There have been a couple of things that started here and there. We want to make sure that we've got a healthy growing studio in the Ottawa region. That is our strategy. That's how we're doing it. However, we had a lot of stuff bust in the last couple of years. The actual plan itself, it's so funny because you get attached to a plan and it's yours and you built it and like all these things you're going to be doing and the plan just falls apart. So that thing ended up falling apart. And I'll talk about the startup J-curve and exponential organizations and a couple of things to be aware of there. Our promotion processes broke. There are some people in this room that were with us as we were going through this and going, how did this actually fall apart into this situation? And it's because you can plan for almost everything, and then there's a whole new series of items that are going to come along and surprise you. We had new problems with no one to staff them. 10 years ago, who heard the terms DEI and ESG in the same frequency that we're hearing them today? And we're running up into this now with people saying, well, I'd love to work for your company, but what's your plan on DEI and ESG? And it's like, well, we don't have somebody dedicated to running that right now. So we have to basically ride on some of the initiatives coming out of the Keywords group, which we're really happy about, but it's something that we have to put some focus on because that's super important to us. Individually, we all agree with the principles behind diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental, social governance, but it's a lot of work to have somebody dedicated working on these particular items. One of the biggest ones, overloaded managers, right? Suddenly, the most trusted people in an organization are always those that are directly managing the majority of people, right? And if they get overloaded, then everything starts to crumble. This was one that surprised us as well. The difficult salary discussions after everybody gets bumped up 15 to 18% and we define new levels and somebody says, well, I don't exactly fit in this new level anymore. And the end result is I'm getting a demotion of 0.06 of a level. Why is this happening? And we're like, you just got a really big raise. How is this an issue, right? So these are the kind of things we didn't think about. Well, we should have because we work with a pile of mathematicians, but learning, humbling experiences. Right, so about this and the things that broke, plans have to adapt. I'm no expert on this. The fellow that wrote this book, Howard Love, basically is. It's called The Startup J-Curve, and basically talks about startup companies and how they need to change. And if you get so attached to your idea, you're almost guaranteed to fail, because his idea was that after 17 startups, you start with an idea, you morph it down at the bottom of that J, and then as you start releasing it into the wild, you morph it even more, and then you go up to that level of scaling. So that's one thing to be aware of there. The other thing is that innovation and growth will get attacked from within. This will happen in almost every single case. Any idea why? I've heard fear of change, and sorry, Tina? Resistance to change. There's a really interesting concept of this called homeostasis in the human body, right? It keeps us all like temperature regulated, energy levels regulated, when you need to sleep, when all of your hormones are operating at a certain level. Organizations are exactly the same. So I'm no expert on this part. This guy, Salim Ismail, did a really good job. There's about a 45-minute YouTube that I really recommend that people watching. I guarantee you'll get something out of it. But he wrote this book called Exponential Organizations. Fantastic piece of literature. And what he's talking about here is that companies, organizations just can't innovate. They just cannot do it. I just picked up a book called Investing in the Apocalypse. It's really fun. It's like a catchy title. It's like, oh, apocalypse. It's talking about pandemics, and this book was written 10 years ago. I was like, kind of weird. But it basically said if a company's not innovating, it is by definition dying. So I was like, yeah, that's the way I've always thought about it. But I had people come back and challenge me on this. Why are we growing? Why are we innovating? Interesting thing about this is that, take a look at Yahoo. They were 10 years old. They couldn't innovate. And they called this guy in to say, what do we need to do? And essentially the idea behind coming up with an innovation group is that you have to split out a group of people that are innovating from the main core line of the business, let them do their thing in the corner, and let that innovation be brought back into the organization. Otherwise, people are going to be resisting it. So again, human beings, or organizations like human bodies, they basically maintain that level of homeostasis. And basically that resistance to change ends up acting like those antibodies attacking it, and then think of like, oh yeah, building muscle in Plato's cave allegory. I'm going back to my philosophical roots here. When you build muscle, it tears, right? And it hurts to come back together, but the muscle comes back bigger and stronger. That's the whole point behind resistance training. Plato's cave allegory is basically that everybody's in the cave looking at the back of like all the shadows on the wall. Nobody wants to leave, right? As soon as somebody walks out and says, okay, well, that's not reality, and they see the light behind you, and they're like, take a look at this fantastic light back here, and there's a huge meadow out there with different things, and you want to go back into the cave and tell people, that's not reality, what's sitting in front of the cave here? And everyone's like, no, forget it, it's comfortable here, don't go show us what these great things are in the meadow, we're happy in this cave. Exactly what Salim Ismail talks about in exponential organizations. All right, so moving along. Our plan, things that changed, right? So we had all these great things that we're doing over a 5-year span, and we're somewhere over here, and we expect it to be a little bit further to the right on this curve. But we've learned a bunch of things, and we want to make sure that we're slowing things down. This is essentially one copy of our plan with just the actual tasks taken out with like growth tasks slotted in. But we have a lot of ambitions for how we want to be moving our studio forward. So basically, don't do it. It sucks. That's my advice. You will lose all your friends. Absolutely everything's going to break. You'll be hated. You'll get angry emails at 9 o'clock at night. Everything's totally fine. We don't need to change. But just in case it's not, there's something to be aware of and why you do need to scale. So first thing, again, I'm getting back to some of the questions I got from people on the floor saying, why are we doing this? And I've been doing this for so long that it didn't quite register. I kind of did like, brain aneurysm going off, going, why do I have to answer this question? And again, that was my own lack of understanding of what everybody was going through, because I get so attached to this idea that this is how we're going to be growing. So I actually asked my profs at school when I was going through my MBA program over the last 3 years and said, how do you answer this question as to why you scale? And they said, it's real simple. These are the things you have to be aware of. Somebody is always coming after you. And for me, that was just like, what? Nah, we're fine. But no, somebody's always coming after your market. They're coming after the product that you're making. They're coming after the service that you're offering. Someone's always coming after you. Someone's always coming after your people. And one way that you can protect that is to scale so you have more opportunities for people to be able to enjoy the work that they're doing in the place where you're working with them. We've seen this right now. Inflation is the really big thing on the news. We've all seen prices go up. I have a lot of feeling for all of our compatriots in Europe right now, watching their energy prices go through the roof. But just through inflation alone, like in a normal year, if you're staying the same, you're by definition dying as a business. So employees themselves, they also need growth, right? We all do. I mean, me as an employee, I needed that. Every employee that we work with that's not in studios needs that. So the tail end of this is they either get it with you or ... they're going to get it someplace else, right? So anybody else that offers that, that's also in a path of growth is going to be able to basically steal the people that you need to help you maintain your business, right? So why do people leave a company? That's a question for everybody here. What do you think?
Better pay.
Better pay? That's about number 4 down the list, but that's a good one. Company culture is probably like tied with like 2 and 3. Probably also tied at 2. Career growth and opportunities, probably tied at number 2 and 3. So, poor management is probably number 1. Poor management indeed. I don't know about you, but the numbers themselves actually stated that the majority of people will leave a bad manager and a toxic culture first before anything else. Nobody ever leaves a job, they leave a manager, right? They leave a culture where they can't grow. There are always exceptions to the rule. But suddenly if somebody has the opportunity for a better manager getting away from a toxic one or one that doesn't help them grow, somebody has the opportunity to do some really cool stuff they haven't had the chance to do before, and bonus, they'll do it for another 25% in pay, it's a done deal, right? But it's those other 2 things, or other 2 or 3 things when it comes down to toxic culture or bad management that basically have people moving on. Right. Another reason that you want to start taking a look at scaling is crisis management. I'm going to talk about this one because this is actually kind of important. Anybody familiar with the crisis curve, how it works? This is actually kind of cool. I was going to school, I learned stuff. So this is about strategic performance of an organization. And we have just seen the example of this, perfect example throughout all of this throughout the last 3 years of the pandemic. Your strategic performance is on the left-hand axis over time. Kind of neat. So performance goes up or down depending on what you do and where you are. The crisis curve says if you get ready for all this and you anticipate change, your performance will go up. If you anticipate as many crises as you possibly can and you're prepared for it, your performance will continue to go up. Who could anticipate the pandemic? We sure as heck didn't. Did anybody here? Probably not. What's really interesting is at reactive change, where we all caught up, is exactly what happens in crisis management. So suddenly we were all working from home, where before publishers said there's no way anybody can work with any of our IP off of the particular site behind a locked door with everything else that's going on. We figured that out. But there was a dip in performance. When you start taking a look at quality of code, quality of relationships, lines of code written, amount of things tested, translated, put together, we did have that dip before it started coming back up again and we normalized. But this is the hard part. If you're just stuck in crisis change, you're all the way down here. Take a look at any of the large oil companies that have to do with a massive environmental disaster. Suddenly everything drops to the floor because they're not anticipating. They're getting to this point at the crisis change bit. And the paradox here is that this is the hardest place to fix. The easiest bit to fix is at the beginning. So, how you shouldn't do it. A couple of things to bear in mind here. Going back to school for a couple of years and getting some education for probably the first time in my life. I think last time I'd actually completed a full year of school was 14 years old before I went back to school now. We heard all these really great terms: weighted average cost of capital, IRR, all these really interesting things that just basically it's like, oh, businessy terms. These things may work for game development, but they typically don't, because we're in a very different kind of industry with very high profit margins, depending how we're managed, right? NPV and DR are probably the two biggest things they teach you at business school. Like, you have to know what this is at all times. I'm like, well, here's how we make money. And they said, no, I don't think that works, Nigel. Like, I don't think you know how business actually works. It's like, well, here's how we make money, guys. What do you guys say to that? It's like, well, I don't think you understand the textbook very well. So this is a very frequent thing where I had to explain how the games industry revenue model worked to my profs. And this was the initial result that I got back from them. And they'd say, well, how does that really work? How much money do you actually make as a business? And this was the result. So what does that actually mean for all of us here? The key takeaways for this is that all that modeling, you should do some of it. If you have the familiarity with it, that's great. You can have business people do that. Do your modeling out for 5 years. But we're not making these massive capital expenditures, right? So we're basically doing operational expenditures, not CapEx. So the standard financial analysis models don't always work. The other key takeaway from this is that you could barrel ahead on willpower and you will fail. So there has to be some background or some balance between those two, between the capital investment, as well as or capital terms, as well as the vision for where you want to go. But if you're only barreling ahead on willpower, you're almost guaranteed to fail. The most important thing that I took away from this is, like, do not ignore the people that are closest to all the change that are saying this really hurts and we have to do things differently. And while we listened to that, we didn't understand it fully until we started deciding that we're going to be changing how things actually go. So they'll tell you about those concerns about the crisis curve. So here are a couple of things about how to go about it. These are surprises that we found from input from our teams. I didn't write all this up. This is actually like copied and pasted from several emails and text messages from managers throughout the studio. This is actual data that we said, you really got to change the way things are going with our change management. This bottom one was the one that surprised the most out of me. It was just like, how about you grow and stabilize, grow and stabilize? And I'm like, boy, that is remarkably smart. Why don't we do that instead of going on this straight curve as everything's breaking? That's kind of the phase that we're in right now. One thing about strategy versus execution itself, strategy, being a cool planner. Like you're a general with a cigar in their mouth going, yeah, I'll strategize about all this. That is so easy. That is basically putting a plan on paper and saying, this is what we're going to do in the next couple of years. It's nothing. The actual hard part where most people fail is the execution. There is no risk in making those plans on paper. One thing that I was talking to a bunch of people at Develop Brighton about this, and they agree that the actual biggest problem about scaling as your studio starts to grow is not having the right people in these roles before you start to do that, whether it's proper PMs, HR, tech management, art management, financial management. These are the places that are going to end up burning you if you don't have them in place before you end up scaling and growing. The other thing, and I did mention this early on, was about change management. And I say, or what we're starting to do now, because we're just at the beginning of starting to do this ourselves properly. And this is where we had our single biggest areas of learning. I think that's a polite way of saying, it didn't go so good, which is change management. And this is basically a change management strategy for how it should be working across any organization that's looking to scale and communicate a change. First thing is identifying it, putting the details together, identifying what your approach is going to be, implementing it, and monitoring it. Are there any other project managers in here? Right. Looks a lot like PM, CM, and basically going through a pattern of identifying, going through that entire process, measuring it, establishing your KPIs, and going on from there. So there's a lot of great details in here. Change management in and of itself is a science. Really read up on it. Paul Cotter wrote a great book called Managing Change, I believe it is, and he's got 3 or 4 others as well. Managing Change is probably one of the best books that you can pick up if you're looking to change an organization over time. And this one's going to give you a lot of insight over what are the mistakes you should be avoiding before you start doing this. Ironically, as we started this process, one of the senior producers came to me and said, hey, Nigel, read this book on change management. And I said, hey, dude, I don't have time for this. Like, I'm supposed to be managing all this other stuff. Year 2 of the MBA, my prof says, here's this book on change management. It's exactly the same book that this particular producer gave me. So that was a very big, humbling, head-bowing experience. But basically, again, it gets back to this point about the people that are actually making this change. The most trusted people in any organization are the ones closest to managing individuals on the floor.
So that's where you need to focus the communication about change management and get all the input as to what's going right and what is not. For us, that's producers, leads from art, technical, et cetera, and because they're managing everybody day to day on the floor, hearing what these concerns are and making sure that we're not basically stepping on our toes when it comes down to implementing this change. So again, we're working on this. One thing that's really interesting that came out of studying in school was a diamond D analysis. So change management, step one, take a look at the actual growth strategy you're putting together. These are nice, pretty colors, but they call it the diamond E because of the diamond on the left and the E for environment. And it's basically, there's an acronym for management preferences, organizational capabilities, resources, strategy, and environment. And so map all these things out. Use your tool to figure out how you're going to grow. These are some of the things that are important to us under each one of these areas. And again, this was actually, I took this out of one of my school assignments because it's actually very apropos to what we're doing with our studio growth. And what was really interesting was that one of my profs said, "This is great, but I'm calling you on your BS. Because everything you've been telling me for the last year and a half is all about the amazing culture of the studio that you're working with. And I don't see that on any of these particular items here." And again, it was one of those, forehead slapping moments going, yeah, totally right. We have to focus on maintaining that before we take a look at any of these other things that are important for us for growth. And it was actually this assignment where she said that. One thing that's really interesting, the personal readiness standpoint, this is basically a change agenda for how that works. You have your starting conditions, your guidelines for actions, plan for actions. Please feel free to take all this. This is not me, right? This is Van den Bosch, a couple of the other references I'll have and some other slides in here as well. But all this, people have done all this work for you, right? You can just go and take these and start mapping them to all the things you have to be aware of. And all of this should literally be like an afternoon's worth of work to identify these particular items. And then the hard part comes, which is communicating that change through a change management strategy. Personal readiness is something you shouldn't forget, though, because when you start doing this with multiple things on the go, something's going to be falling off, whether it's impacts to your health or stress and things of that nature. So for me, implementing this plan plus an MBA workload is significant was the way of saying it's almost impossible for me to do this without getting a heart attack. So that's one thing you have to be aware of. KPIs is another big thing. Make sure that if you've got the same kind of values that we share, like people first, then your KPIs need to be able to reflect that. It can't just be the straight numbers of what you're doing with profit, et cetera. So one of ours is measuring workforce satisfaction. How happy are people with all the changes that are coming? You can basically measure retention, revenue, and growth. What's the really big KPI everyone's using these days? Net Promoter Score, right? Everyone's heard it? No? Yes? No? NPS? NPS is kind of interesting. I remember talking to my marketing prof about that, and he was just like spitting and he got so mad. He says, "I hate NPS." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Because it's one-dimensional. It only covers one particular thing. So use it, but use it in conjunction with other things as well, and just make sure that they end up passing the sniff test for scientific validity and reliability." So these are the things that all your KPIs have to pass that bar for. Now, I'm going to talk about the 4 key pillars of successful growth in the last couple of minutes that I have here. Again, this is not me. I put the Globe and Mail logo up there because this came out of the May issue of Report on Business, because they took the top 100 managed companies in Canada, and their criteria was there's a Canadian company headquartered here, and basically applied a couple of key pillars that were really important, and this is something I'd really like to stress. First off, you have to have a plan. Strategy's pillar number 1, right? Have a formal methodology in place for that. Making sure that you've got the right stakeholders that are involved and the communications reflecting that. Number 2, like this is well beyond any of the financial stuff, right? The plan first, culture next, making sure you've got this culture that supports that and you're promoting that culture from within as to what that actually looks like. Actively developing people and the leadership team. Super important. For us, I like to stress all this, that culture, you can talk about culture all the time. For me and for all of us, that's not going like, rah, 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 we're the greatest studio ever, and then everybody gets ground into the dirt with overtime. That's not how we operate. For us, it's like a fancy word of saying how we act, how we talk. Do the things that we're actually doing match what we said we're going to be doing, which is the basis of our culture and integrity. Capabilities and innovation, pillar number 3. That's pretty straightforward. And then governance and financials, where a lot of people do fall down or just put all their stress there. Again, this is not me, it's not Nigel talking about this. This is the Globe and Mail with their top 100 best managed companies. And the thing I have to admit is, like, we're still working on all of these. We don't have this nailed yet, right? This is just now taking a look at all of this and saying, all right, we know what our next steps are for how we're going to be implementing our next stage of growth. Hence the growth, stabilize, growth, stabilize. That stabilization point in here for us is making sure we've got all this right and nailed before we get to that next stage. Because we have pretty big, ambitious plans. So growth itself is creative destruction. A lot of startup founders talk about creative destruction when it comes down to growth. Again, I really want to stress that planning is the easy part. Execution's tough. Use your tools. They're kind of neat. Like, you can do a SWOT analysis or the reverse of that, which is TOES analysis, which is very popular these days. But you have to shift to change management as one of your keys, and really understanding change management to do that successfully. I say read up on it like a crazy person, because I strongly recommend doing that. There are so many different insights that are really going to help you along the way. Take a look at those 4 pillars: strategy, culture, capabilities, innovation, and governance. And then use the metrics that actually make sense for you, right? The ones that actually make sense for what your culture is that you're trying to maintain inside your organization. Now, with all of this, surprises can come at any time. This helps you to understand and minimize the impact those surprises will have in a really big way. So you've got a couple options, right? Decide to scale, decide not to scale. I strongly recommend, for the growth of your business, that you have those really big, audacious goals, because they are going to help you survive things like pandemics and other challenges that are coming along. I go back to these guys. Rule 9, opportunity plus instinct equals profit. You can be in the middle, the way that Aristotle said, the middle path is always the way, it's never in the extremes. We're in business. We're here to make cool games, do amazing creative things, but it's still a business. So we have to be aware of that. With that, I have to say, be bold, move forward, and do what Peter Drucker says: the best way in order to be able to predict the future is for you to create it. So thank you.